Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. In today's video, we are going to cover a 33-year-old's case which has just been afforded a glimpse of hope at being finally recognized as a miscarriage of justice. This is the case of a gentle giant, as he was known by his close circle, Mr. Oliver Campbell. We will first give a brief overview of the event that involved Mr. Campbell with the criminal justice system. Secondly, we are going to take a look at the evidence presented at the trial. And finally, we will look at whether the time for Mr. Campbell to have his conviction quashed after 33 years is at a long last arrived. Starting with the crime, here is a brief overview of what happened. On the 22nd of July 1990, a shopkeeper, Mr. Hundel, was shot dead during a robbery at his family-owned off-licensed shop in Hackney. As always, by discussing this case, we do not wish to cause any distress to the secondary victims of this crime, to whom we send our best wishes. Within 5 months of the crime, under pressure police arrested 2 people who they linked to the crime thanks to a baseball cap found in the vicinity of the crime scene, said to have been dropped by the murderer whilst fleeing the crime scene. One of them was Oliver Campbell, then 19 years old. A second suspect pleaded guilty to robbery, was sentenced and subsequently released 5 years into his sentence. Mr. Campbell's case proceeded to trial. The prosecution essentially relied on 3 main pieces of evidence: confessions made by Mr. Campbell, a cap found in the vicinity of the crime scene, and a witness who picked Mr. Campbell up at an ID parade. Mr. Campbell was found guilty in December 1991 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 11 years in prison and was released on license in 2002. Mr. Campbell, though initially confessed to the murder, he later retracted it and he since maintained his innocence. Before we go into our second part of the video, if you're finding this video interesting, please like it and subscribe to our channel so that we can continue bringing to you more stories like this which illustrate the fallibility of our criminal justice system. On the 6th of January 2002, this case was covered by Rough Justice, a British television programme produced by Peter Hale and presented by Martin Young, which investigated alleged miscarriages of justice and was broadcast on BBC between 1982 and 2007. This episode dedicated to Mr. Campbell, titled If the Cap Fits, is no longer available on the iPlayer, but we have found it reproduced in a YouTube channel called Centre Divide. The link is provided in the description below. Each episode of the Rough Justice series covered a story. The aim was to unpick the evidence presented in court and provide an alternative narrative. The episode dedicated to Mr. Campbell was no exception. The programme first looked at the main evidence, the baseball cap found in the vicinity of the crime scene. The police traced the cap back to a sports store in East London. The sales representative identified Mr. Campbell as the buyer. Mr. Campbell did not dispute that the cap was his, but he maintained that this was taken from him by another man before the crime. Secondly, the program revealed that witnesses at the scene described the two robbers to be between 5 feet 10 inches and 5 feet 11 inches tall. Mr. Campbell's height is rather striking and will not go unnoticed. He stands at a towering 6 feet 3 inches tall. He was known in his close circle as the Gentle Giant. A passerby and the son of the deceased shopkeeper failed to identify Mr. Campbell at an ID parade. There was only one witness who picked Mr. Campbell up at the ID parade, but only at his second attempt. He was the same person who coincidentally found the cap. His testimony was, however, so inconsistent that even the trial judge issued a warning to the jury about his reliability. In relation to Mr. Campbell's confession, first, Rough Justice revealed from his medical notes that when he was 8 months old, he sustained a severe brain trauma that had left him with serious shortcomings. His IQ was registered as borderline mentally defective. By the time of his arrest, he spent most of his 20 years in care. Though his mental shortcomings should have been apparent to those who questioned him, he was initially questioned by police without the presence of a legal representative or an appropriate adult. This is generally a carer or relative allowed to attend when the questioning involves either a child or a vulnerable individual. During his first interview, he declined legal representation and he was then driven by police to another police station. During this time, he was questioned on several occasions, but very little or no record was made of this questioning. Only several hours later, he was seen by a doctor and his mental limitations finally recognized. And only then he was finally afforded interview with full legal representations and accompanied by an appropriate adult. During that interview, several things were put to him which were uncorroborated at that stage. For example, that the hair in the cap might be his, or that fingerprints retrieved at the crime scene might match his, and that witnesses had seen him at the crime scene. However, whilst he kept his resolve, whilst his solicitor was there, he crumbled that same evening as soon as his solicitor left, and he confessed to the murder after speaking to his then foster mother. A forensic psychologist instructed by Rough Justice to look into Mr. Campbell's confession, however, found the confession as internally inconsistent. For example, he said that he dropped the cap in the shop when in fact the cap was found outside the shop. He also said that he had hired a gun but could not say where from. He said he practiced firing the gun but could not recall where, and that he fixed the gun under his arm with a string. The narrative was not consistent. But what led him to confess? First, we know that he watched the reconstructions of the crime on Crime Watch before being arrested. Secondly, we know that he was subjected to intense questioning with no adjustments to compensate for his vulnerability and susceptibility. The uncorroborated suggestions made by the police that forensic evidence linked him to the crime and the relentless questioning and pressure on him undoubtedly must have played a pivotal part on a highly susceptible and vulnerable individual like Mr. Campbell with learning disabilities and with impaired memory and reasoning skills. As you may recall, we discussed this in our video, Fact or Fiction, False Memory on Trial, which you can find linked in the description below, where we looked at how false memories can also lead to false confessions. Suspects may come to believe they committed a crime they did not, especially if subjected to coercive or suggestive interrogation techniques. Here, the suggestions that there was forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene and his prior watching of the reconstructions on Crime Watch could have easily led to his false confession. But rough justice did not stop there. They commissioned a ballistic analysis, the result of which determined that the angle of entry of the fatal shot that killed Mr. Hundel came from a right-handed individual. The ballistic expert was 99% sure. Independent observation of Mr. Campbell and physical tests conducted on him determined that Mr. Campbell was in fact left-handed. However, perhaps the most important revelation of the rough justice episode was the existence of a non-signed sworn statement by Mr. Campbell's co-accused, Mr. Samuels, which was never shown to the jury and which gave a more coherent account of what happened that night. This statement was not given whilst Mr. Samuels was interviewed under caution, but after he was sentenced and before Mr. Campbell's trial. This is his account of events. He, Mr. Samuels, Mr. Campbell and a third man were at Leicester Square the afternoon before the murder. It was here that the third man took Mr. Campbell's cab. Mr. Campbell then left and the two men went on to commit the robbery. And the third man executed the fatal shot, leaving the cab earlier stolen from Mr. Campbell whilst fleeing the murder scene. This statement was not presented to the jury as it was deemed to be inadmissible. Samuels did not give evidence in Mr. Campbell's trial for fear of repercussions by the third man and for fear to implicating himself in the murder. Rough Justice also disclosed that a man who matched the name, location and characteristics of the third man named by Mr. Samuels was interviewed by the police 5 weeks after Mr. Campbell had confessed. He denied any involvement in the crime but declined to give hair samples. We understand from an article published in The Guardian on the 2nd of October 2023 that Mr. Samuels is now deceased. Finally, hair found in the cab was analysed and did not match Mr. Campbell. Additionally, fingerprints taken at the crime scene did not match Mr. Campbell. there was no forensic evidence linking Mr. Campbell to the crime scene. Ultimately, Rough Justice concluded that the independent analysis of the crime and Mr. Campbell's disability makes it highly unlikely that he was the murderer. Mr. Campbell applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to have his case referred to the Court of Appeal in 2002. But his initial application was rejected in 2004 as it determined that there was no new evidence to warrant a referral. This decision was criticised by Labour MP for Ipswich, Sandy Martin, on the 17th of July 2019, when parliamentarians took part in an all-party parliamentary group on miscarriages of justice, debating on the decision-making powers of the CCRC. Let's take a look at what he said.
After the BBC's Rush Justice programme, detailed and extensive submissions were made to the Criminal Cases Review Commission by Oliver's legal team, including his solicitor, Glyn Maddox, and his eminent QC, Michael Birnbaum, with the clear hope and expectation that the Commission would refer Oliver's case back to the Court of Appeal. After 2 long years, the CCRC concluded that there was nothing new to form the basis of a fresh appeal, and therefore no appeal. This was despite a recent change in the law which now enabled the Court of Appeal to rely on the statements Eric Samuels had made in which he completely exonerated Oliver. The CCRC also ignored the reports of 2 very eminent psychologists who explained Oliver's acquiescence to police questioning due to his limited mental capacity and his eagerness to please and to be accepted. As Kirsty Walk reported at the end of the Rough Justice programme, this evidence of Oliver's mental state, which had never been brought before the jury, constituted fresh new evidence which points to a terrible miscarriage of justice.
Mr. Campbell renewed his application to the CCRC in 2020. Speaking on BBC Newsnight on the 16th of March 2022, Mr. Campbell said, "I was put under pressure to say things that I didn't want to say at the end of the day, to admit to something that I didn't do, and I felt scared at the time." On the 24th of November 2022, the CCRC in a press release stated, "The Criminal Cases Review Commission has referred a 1991 murder conviction to the Court of Appeal after obtaining new expert evidence about the defendant's vulnerability." The jury at Mr. Campbell's trial knew that he had learning disability with impaired memory and reasoning skills. However, an expert report concluded that it was not abnormally suggestible. During its review, the CCRC approached that same expert and invited him to reconsider his assessment of Mr. Campbell. The expert concluded that he had not properly understood Mr. Campbell's vulnerabilities at the time of trial or appeal. A second expert, instructed by the CCRC, explained how a modern approach to assessing Mr. Campbell would take a more holistic view that considered his background and experience. This expert agreed that there were reasons why Mr. Campbell may have given unreliable evidence which were not fully understood or explained to the jury at the time. The preliminary hearing for Mr. Campbell's appeal took place on the 11th of October 2023 before Lord Justice Holroyd, Mr. Justice McGowan and Mrs. Justice Stein. The court will set a date for a 2-day substantive hearing within 28 days. We wish Mr. Campbell all the best, and we will keep you updated on the progress of his appeal. I hope you have found this video interesting, and if so, please like it and subscribe to our channel so that we can bring to you more stories that show the fallibility of our criminal justice system. Also, join our networking hub at spokeninjustice.net to have your say as to the future content of this channel. Join us again next week. We look forward to usher you as we sit and rise in this unique trial.